Chapter 22 of Hans Brinker. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Hans Brinker, or The Silver Skates, by Mary Mapes Dodge. Chapter 22. The Red Lion Becomes Dangerous. The boys were glad to find a blazing fire awaiting them upon their return to the Red Lion. Carl and his party were there first. Soon afterward Peter and Jacob came in. They had inquired in vain concerning Dr. Boekman. All they could ascertain was that he had been seen in Haarlem that morning. "As for his being in Leyden," the landlord of the Golden Eagle had said to Peter, "the thing is impossible. He always lodges here when in town. By this time there would be a crowd at my door waiting to consult him. Bah, people make such fools of themselves." "He is called a great surgeon," said Peter. "Yes, the greatest in Holland. But what of that? What of being the greatest pill-choker and knife-slasher in the world? The man is a bear. Only last month on this very spot he called me a pig before 3 customers." "No!" exclaimed Peter, trying to look surprised and indignant. "Yes, master, a pig," repeated the landlord, puffing at his pipe with an injured air. "Bah! If he did not pay fine prices and bring customers to my house, I would sooner see him in the Vleit Canal than give him lodging." Perhaps mine host felt that he was speaking too openly to a stranger, or it may be that he saw a smile lurking in Peter's face. For he added sharply, "Come now, what more do you wish? Supper? Beds?" "No, mynheer. I am but searching for Dr. Boekman." "Go find him. He is not in Leyden." Peter was not to be put off so easily. He succeeded in obtaining permission to leave a note for the famous surgeon, or rather, he bought from his amiable landlord the privilege of writing it there, and a promise that it should be promptly delivered when Dr. Boekman arrived. This accomplished, Peter and Jacob returned to the Red Lion. This inn had once been a fine house, the home of a rich burgher, but having grown old and shabby, it had passed through many hands until finally it had fallen into the possession of Mynheer Kleef. He was fond of saying as he looked up at its dingy, broken walls, "Mend it and paint it, and there's not a prettier house in Leyden." It stood 6 stories high from the street. The first 3 were of equal breadth, but of various heights. The last 3 were in the great, high roof, and grew smaller and smaller like a set of double steps until the top one was lost in a point. The roof was built of short, shining tiles, and the windows, with their little panes, seemed to be scattered irregularly over the face of the building, without the slightest attention to outward effect. But the public room on the ground floor was the landlord's joy and pride. He never said, "Mend it and paint it," there, for everything was in the highest condition of Dutch neatness and order. If you will but open your mind's eye, you may look into the apartment. Imagine a large, bare room, with a floor that seemed to be made of squares cut out of glazed earthen pie dishes. First a yellow piece, then a red, until the whole looked like a vast checkerboard. Fancy a dozen high-backed wooden chairs standing around. Then, a great hollow chimney-place all aglow with its blazing fire, reflected 100 times in the polished steel fire-dogs. A tiled hearth, tiled sides, tiled top, with a Dutch sentence upon it, and over all, high above one's head, a narrow mantel-shelf, filled with shining brass candlesticks, pipe-lighters, and tinder-boxes. Then see, in one end of the room, 3 pine tables, in the other, a closet and a deal dresser. The latter is filled with mugs, dishes, pipes, tankards, earthen and glass bottles, and is guarded at one end by a brass-hooped keg standing upon long legs. Everything is dim with tobacco smoke, but otherwise as clean as soap and sand can make it. Next, picture 2 sleepy, shabby-looking men, in wooden shoes, seated near the glowing fireplace, hugging their knees and smoking short, stumpy pipes. Mynheer Kleef walking softly and heavily about, clad in leather knee-breeches, felt shoes, and a green jacket wider than it is long. Then throw a heap of skates in the corner, and put 6 tired, well-dressed boys, in various attitudes, upon the wooden chairs, and you will see the coffee-room of the Red Lion just as it appeared at 9 o'clock upon the evening of December 6. For supper, gingerbread again, slices of Dutch sausage, rye bread sprinkled with anise seed, pickles, a bottle of Utrecht water, and a pot of very mysterious coffee. The boys were ravenous enough to take all they could get and pronounce it excellent. Ben made wry faces, but Jacob declared he had never eaten a better meal. After they had laughed and talked a while, and counted their money by way of settling a discussion that arose concerning their expenses, the captain marched his company off to bed, led on by a greasy pioneer boy who carried skates and a candlestick instead of an axe. One of the ill-favored men by the fire had shuffled toward the dresser and was ordering a mug of beer, just as Ludwig, who brought up the rear, was stepping from the apartment. "I don't like that fellow's eye," he whispered to Carl. "He looks like a pirate or something of that kind." "Looks like a granny," answered Carl in sleepy disdain. Ludwig laughed uneasily. "Granny or no granny," he whispered, "I tell you he looks just like one of those men in the Voetspoelen." "Pooh!" sneered Carl. "I knew it. That picture was too much for you. Look sharp now and see if yon fellow with the candle doesn't look like the other villain." "No, indeed, his face is as honest as a Gouda cheese. But I say, Carl, that really was a horrid picture." "Huh! What did you stare at it so long for?" "I couldn't help it." By this time the boys had reached the beautiful room with 3 beds in it. A dumpy little maiden with long earrings met them at the doorway, dropped them a curtsy, and passed out. She carried a long-handled thing that resembled a frying-pan with a cover. "I am glad to see that," said Van Mounen to Ben. "What?" "Why, the warming-pan. It's full of hot ashes. She's been heating our beds." "Oh, a warming-pan, eh? Much obliged to her, I'm sure," said Ben, too sleepy to make any further comment. Meantime, Ludwig still talked of the picture that had made such a strong impression upon him. He had seen it in a shop window during their walk. It was a poorly painted thing, representing 2 men tied back to back, standing on shipboard, surrounded by a group of seamen who were preparing to cast them together into the sea. This mode of putting prisoners to death was called voetspoelen, or feet-washing, and was practiced by the Dutch upon the pirates of Dunkirk in 1605, and again by the Spaniards against the Dutch, in the horrible massacre that followed the siege of Haarlem. Bad as the painting was, the expression upon the pirates' faces was well given. Sullen and despairing as they seemed, they wore such a cruel, malignant aspect that Ludwig had felt a secret satisfaction in contemplating their helpless condition. He might have forgotten the scene by this time but for that ill-looking man by the fire. Now, while he capered about boylike and threw himself with an antic into his bed, he inwardly hoped that the voetspoelen would not haunt his dreams. It was a cold, cheerless room. A fire had been newly kindled in the burnished stove, and seemed to shiver even while it was trying to burn. The windows, with their funny little panes, were bare and shiny, and the cold waxed floor looked like a sheet of yellow ice. 3 rush-bottomed chairs stood stiffly against the wall, alternating with 3 narrow wooden bedsteads that made the room look like the deserted ward of a hospital. At any other time the boys would have found it quite impossible to sleep in pairs, especially in such narrow quarters, but tonight they lost all fear of being crowded, and longed only to lay their weary bodies upon the feather beds that lay lightly upon each cot. Had the boys been in Germany instead of Holland, they might have been covered, also, by a bed of down or feathers,